Welcome to Free Thoughts from Libertarianism.org and the Cato Institute. I'm Aaron Ross Powell, editor of Libertarianism.org and a research fellow here at the Cato Institute.
And I'm Trevor Burrus, a research fellow at the Cato Institute Center for Constitutional Studies.
Joining us today is Michael Shermer. Dr. Shermer is founding publisher of Skeptic Magazine, executive director of the Skeptics Society, and a columnist for Scientific American. He's the author of many books. His newest is The Moral Arc: How Science and Reason Lead Humanity Toward Truth, Justice, and Freedom. Your book tells a story of moral progress and how that progress was driven not by philosophy or religion but by science. So before we delve into the details of that story, can you maybe just give us the big picture?
The big picture is that after the scientific revolution, most thinkers in Europe were inspired by Galileo, Newton, Harvey, and so on, and wanted to be the equivalent of that in their own fields. So Thomas Hobbes, for example, self-consciously said, "I want to be the Galileo, the William Harvey of civil society." And his book Leviathan is one of the most important, influential political treatises ever written, and it is a materialistic work beginning with atoms in motion, all the way up to how we perceive things through our senses with atoms impinging on our senses, and how we form simple ideas, and simple ideas form compound ideas, and on he goes until you get to civil society. Now, Leviathan was supposed to be a three-part work. The whole first part was just like the physics and biology, and then the second part was psychology, and then the third part was society. But he ran out of time, so he just put it all into one. But the point of that is that he's saying that we have a problem here. There's too many issues in society. There has to be a way to solve these rationally, scientifically. So I'm going to do it this way, and he builds the best science of his day.
And what specifically had Harvey and Galileo and everyone done that was different? I mean, we like to say science, but –
Yeah, well, so it's a naturalistic worldview, that the universe is materialistic, deterministic, and there is no supernatural. There's just the natural. They're just natural forces, and we can understand them. And that's what Newton did by tying in celestial mechanics with terrestrial mechanics, basically arguing it's all knowable – and you can actually write equations to describe it. So therefore, the human mind is capable of understanding how the universe works, and it's a mechanical process. So Hobbes's whole thing, his whole treatise, is that it is mechanical. The atoms in motion ending up with a society, with a social contract and all that. In the Leviathan, that is a purely materialistic, naturalistic worldview.
So this new contribution then that came about during the Enlightenment, not just in what we traditionally think of as science, but in moral philosophy, was this new way of thinking that was taking principles of reason, using principles of reason, but also not dependent upon any sort of supernatural stuff. Am I understanding that correctly?
That's correct. Yep. Mm-hmm. So therefore, you're really taking God out of the equation.
Sure.
Even though most people at the time weren't atheists, they were just saying that's a separate thing. Let's just talk about what we know, what we can know.
It seems that different, though, to say the way that Newton talked about God is we can understand all of this and still understand that behind the world and the mechanistic operations there can still be a God.
Yes, Newton was a believer or a deist or whatever he actually was by today's labels, but it didn't matter because he wasn't invoking God unless he needed to. His attempt was to close the gap, the God of the gaps arguments. He was eliminating gaps by saying, it's just gravity. This is gravity doing all this, and here I have equations to describe it. And so he eliminated a lot of the need for a deity.
I'm curious, you say that this came about during the Enlightenment, that this new way of thinking about morality, you call it secular humanism.
Uh-huh.
But what you're describing sounds an awful lot like many thinkers before then. So I'm thinking of the Greeks, the Hellenistic philosophers.
Mm-hmm.
Aristotle gave us a godless view of morality and humanity.
Mm-hmm.
The Epicureans, the Stoics, Buddhism arguably was non-supernatural. So are those different somehow from what happened during the Enlightenment and after?
Yeah, they're different in their specifics. Had those taken root, we might be much further along now than we are. But there was that thing, the Dark Ages. That book, The Swerve, in which so the rediscovery of some of these old naturalistic texts from the ancient Greeks and republishing them, and then those got some traction, and all that was part of the scientific revolution, which underneath it was this materialistic, naturalistic worldview. So we lost a few centuries. We'd probably be colonizing the galaxy by now.
It is pretty astounding how much they destroyed in the process of Christianizing the world.
Yep.
And The Swerve is definitely a great book to talk about that. But we've been talking about science, but we also have this rights thing, which is maybe related to it or a separate vein.
I think they are. I think so. I mean, most people think of rights as just a pure philosophical or metaphysical concept. Bentham famously described rights as nonsense and natural rights as nonsense
on stilts.
Yeah. But he didn't have Darwin. He didn't have evolutionary theory. He didn't have any sound theory of human nature like we have now. We understand much more than they did back then. As brilliant as those people were, they didn't know a fraction of what we know today. So I try to make the case in any case in the moral arc for natural rights that you can start. So you got to start somewhere. So I start with the survival and flourishing of sentient beings. So like Bentham, I use sentience, meaning can you feel and suffer and experience pain? Because when we're talking about morality, we're talking about are people being harmed or helped? Interactions. If you're by yourself on an island, there's no morality. So it's the survival and flourishing of sentient beings. Why individuals? Because natural selection operates on the individual. And then why sentience? Because that connects us to other species, and that's how brains operate. And then I just use survival and flourishing because that's what natural selection does. It gives us a drive to survive and thrive and flourish as just part of our nature. And so you have to start somewhere. That's where I start. I know that most of my fellow atheist, skeptic, scientists don't agree with that. They don't think it's possible to ground it in anything objective. That it really is culturally relative, even though they're personally not cultural relativists or moral relativists, and they don't quite go that far. But they always invoke Hume. You can't the naturalistic fallacy. You can't go from the way something is to the way it ought to be. But I say nonsense. We already do that a lot.
It seems weird to say, though, that it's my opinion that Hitler was bad.
Right, and most people don't. I mean, but if you push them on something like that, they go, well, of course he was bad. Well, how do you know he's bad? It's sort of a Western thing. Or if you push like female genital mutilation, yes, of course I think that's terrible. But I can't completely condemn the Somalis for doing that to their women. Why not?
This concept of flourishing is really important to your story because much of the book is talking about how we have increased flourishing, how we've gotten better at enabling people to flourish in the world. So can you tell us a bit more about what you actually mean by flourishing? What does it mean for someone to flourish? What is necessary for someone to flourish?
Physical and mental health, happiness, satisfaction, having fulfilling lives, relationships. That there's some subjectivity to how you might flourish and how you versus me or something. I like to go ride my bike. You like to do something else. You do something still else. That doesn't matter. It's just the idea of whatever makes you feel fulfilled. Obviously, not murdering other people makes me feel flourishing. That first of all, that's super rare. And in any case, something else would trump that that we can get into later. But again, you have to start with something. And the animal rights activists, they start with Bentham, and it isn't important can they think or have intelligence or use tools. It's can they suffer and feel, because that's really what we're talking about when care of other people that need help, helping the moral aspect of humanity.
And that's helped create an expanding circle, as you described, because you just mentioned animals and different people that it seems that we've brought them into the circle of care, I guess would be the right way of putting it.
I like the sphere as a metaphor because it's multidimensional versus a circle, which is on a flat plane. But Peter Singer's idea that he laid out in the early 80s, I think that's held up pretty well. That is what we've been doing. So just think about incorporating gay rights and same-sex marriage into the sphere. That's all we're doing. That's all they're asking. Just let us do what everybody else – just bring us into this circle, this sphere. And that's what we're doing.
The use of government, so because this is now we kind of get to rights and how government relates to people. And that's particularly what we're interested, of course, here at Cato, and how this assertion against government. And so we described Hobbes and how we get forward in the mechanistic view. How do you think this changed people's idea of the relationship between people and the government with these new ideas of science and rights?
Yeah, well, first of all, you wouldn't want to live in Hobbes' society. The Leviathan is
I'm not nearly strong enough, and I have to sleep sometime. Yes,
it's pretty draconian, and but these are the hard issues. We can do the low hanging fruit that I do in my talks, but to what extent should the state step in to intervene in somebody's private religious beliefs that diseases are not caused by germs, but they're caused by negative thoughts, and we should just pray. You're familiar with these cases, and it's hard. Individual liberty versus the government protecting those who can't protect themselves.
Your notion of flourishing ends up – you talk about natural rights, and it makes me think of the natural law theories of – I'll cite a Catholic, Thomas Aquinas, who kind of approached a similar sort of we need to think about what are the goods, what's good for a good life. And he looked to the things that were desired by everyone, and he came up with what procreation and life and knowledge and sociability, which actually looks quite a lot like your list of things. And so the idea then is, are we correct is the morality that you argue similar to his in the sense that then the things that are morally wrong or right are those things that enhance those necessary things for flourishing, and those would be the good things, and then things that are morally wrong are the things that undermine those necessary constituent parts of flourishing?
It's a place to start. It's a good place to start. But, of course, you're going to find exceptions to that. The person that flourishes from torturing animals, or, the psychopath or the sadist or masochist, and, yes, of course there are those. So we have to make exceptions. But for the most part, it's a good place to start.
Interestingly, in your book, when you taught the animal rights chapter, about maybe 2/3 of the way through it or so, you just come forward and say, I do eat meat, and I wear animals, and that kind of surprised me.
I had a meat sandwich today. I know. Well, we're all inconsistent.
Oh, of course, yeah.
I routinely tell people, if I were a better person, I would be a vegetarian.
Yeah.
But my will is not strong enough.
The animal rights activists have good arguments. They really do. And they follow pretty much on the footsteps of all the great rights revolutionaries in the past. The arguments they made against abolition of slavery and women's right to vote and so on. And so I can't say that they're wrong. What makes it hard is that we have to eat. You don't have to have a slave. You can flourish just fine without a slave. But you have to eat. And so now where I live in L.A., there's tons of great vegan restaurants with really good food. But it's other times it's hard to not eat meat, and it's tasty, and that makes it hard. So for a while I didn't, when I was writing that chapter anyway, because I watched all those awful hidden camera documentaries,
horrible, absolutely, yeah.
Factory farms, and I had to cover my eyes and peek through my fingers to see what was going on the screen, and there you don't want to do it because it's really bringing it home. But that's what the whole point of it is. You want to. Like Harriet Tubman's, Uncle Tom's Cabin. The whole point of that was just to make people aware of this is what it's like. And then you read it. So this is the argument about literacy and rights revolutions, just making people aware of what it's like to be in that condition. And, and that's that. So all rights revolutionaries since then have tried to put people, interchange perspective, put people into that position to see how you would feel.
How do you think this is – you mentioned two things that were interesting, like in terms of not eating a slave or eating meat. And something we talk about a lot here at Cato is the growth of human prosperity, and it's in your book, the hockey stick graph. Yeah. But there seems to be a relationship between the moral arc, as you're describing it, and prosperity. There are some things that you may not be prosperous enough to care about. You talk about the walrus hunters in the animal chapter. So maybe poor people have a hard time being moral in many situations.
That's right. If you live in Africa, who cares about the animal rights? I don't have any rights. So you gotta get your. So the solution is we got to make these people prosperous and successful, and then they'll get education. With democracies comes better education. With free markets comes more money for better education, and then with that comes all the other goodies. And so, yeah, you got to start somewhere. Which is why I like the Gates Foundations. You know, they're not going for these lofty utopian things. They're just saying, let's see if we can just eliminate this one thing right here, and let's see if we can have a better toilets. And just really basic stuff that allow people then to care about the next level up. And eventually, we'll get to caring about the environment. But in any case, the more educated you are, the fewer children you have, and therefore less pressures on the environment. So again, just get people to get China through the Industrial Revolution as quick as possible, and get them up to speed on renewables and whatever they got to do to get their population under control, and that's progress.
So then, as part of this story of progress, is it that increasing wealth is what leads to moral progress, or is it, which is what you've just been talking about, that we need to get them to certain levels of income so that then they can start caring about these things, or is it that the moral progress is what results in the increasing wealth, or is it somewhere in between?
Well, it's both, but the hockey stick curve comes a bit after the rights revolutions and the humanitarian revolutions had already been well underway. So that's probably not the cause. It's probably interactive, and they're both caused by something else, and then it feeds into it in a positive way. For a while, I was toying with the life is hard theory of why people are mean and nasty, because who cares? Life is so grim. But as Pinger points out, you could just easily make the opposite argument that if life is grim, then I'm really going to feel bad for you because I know what it feels like to be poor and diseased and miserable. So it isn't clear which way it should go. And in any case, the whole increase in wealth after the Industrial Revolution comes well after the rights revolutions were already underway. So we're looking at something else. But all things being equal, it's better to be prosperous and wealthy than not, for a whole bunch of other reasons that helps propel it along faster.
I confess it as I was reading through it, being a little bit uncertain at times precisely what you meant by moral progress that we were tracking, because at sometimes there's the question of, do you mean progress in the sense of our values, those things that we think are morally valuable are changing, getting better in some way. Poor values are being replaced with better values. Or do you mean it in the sense that, like you could expand on what this means, what is it, the witch theory of causality, yes. Yeah. That in that instance, which you describe as progress, like abandoning the witch theory of causality is moral progress. But in there, what you're saying is it's better. Our underlying moral values haven't changed. People thought it was not okay to harm, or that it was okay to stop people from harming, but their data changed. Their knowledge of the world changed such that they now don't think what they thought was harm wasn't actually harmful.
That's what I mean by moral progress mostly, and also very specific measurable things: decline in homicides, abolition of slavery, the expansion of rights for women and blacks, and so forth. Very specific measurable things instead of something a little more metaphysical like what we have different moral values, but what does it mean?
Or the rights revolution.
The rights
would be.
Yeah, but even there, the rights. Well, what are we talking about? The right to vote. Okay, so I can go in and actually stamp a ballot. So that's an actual specific thing. Or I'm less likely to die or be enslaved or tortured living today than had I lived centuries ago, and or thousands of years ago. So these are just very specific instances like that. I'm not a philosopher. I'm a science guy. So, I'm looking at things that are quantitative, measurable. Life is better if you have 3 square meals a day rather than 2. If you make 10,000 a year versus 6,000 a year. Just North Korea, South Korea, just very specific things. They're 3 inches shorter. That's not good. I can see the difference.
Okay. That form of that moral progress, what are some of the, most striking examples, the biggest examples of moral progress that you talk about?
Right. So, as I mentioned, the abolition of slavery, the various rights revolutions, humanitarian revolutions that abolished torture, and the death penalty, which is almost gone. Those kinds of things. Just the decline of war, the number of people that die in war, the percentage of populations that die in conflicts, the number of conflicts that there are between Western powers is declined dramatically. All of those add up to I'm less likely to die, and I'm more likely to flourish. And again, I don't like talking about groups like, this race or that nation or that gender. It's you. It's me. It's an individual person that's less likely to be harmed or killed and more likely to be prosperous and flourish. And that's my measure, my criteria.
It's striking that when you look back at people at 16th century, 17th century, sometimes you wonder if everyone in the society were sadists, with public executions, bear baiting, the kind of thing that they thought was a good time,
right,
and is now absolutely reprehensible. It does seem like something is going on.
Okay, that would be an example of something like a value, I suppose, that we don't think it's fun anymore, to torture cats or bear baiting, what. So there our sentiments have expanded to being concerned about the welfare and suffering of other sentient beings like dogs and bears, cats and bears. So that would be progress in a value, a moral value, in a very measurable way.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. The interesting thing that Aaron and I were talking about before was, in Aristotle, for example, it's unclear, and I think your book does a pretty good job of explaining this. He thinks that there are natural slaves, but he thinks that they need to be slaves because it helps them flourish. So perhaps he's just making a scientific error, a factual error.
That's right.
And that's why, like the witch causality, people are just getting better at understanding that this is the same type of thing as this.
Another criteria is to ask the affected party how they would feel. Like, hey, I'm pretty sure you'll be flourishing better as a slave. What do you think?
Uh-huh.
No, I actually don't really think that. Or the woman, how about we torture you on the pyre there? No, I actually don't really want to do that.
And then we get to the difficult questions, because one thing from the libertarian standpoint that struck me in your book, and I don't – do you think you consider yourself totally libertarian but friendly or whatever?
Yeah, small L libertarian maybe, yeah.
But there seems to be a danger in there, possibly – someone could read it incorrectly – that the misuse of science, the overuse of science to the point of trumping rights, that because science has been used for some really horrible things, eugenics, for example,
right,
and things like this, and the idea that there are some people who have the idea that science is so right that perhaps we should just make more bureaucracies, more technocracies,
turn the rule over to scientists,
central planning, all these things. And if you get too encumbered, one thing that the Dinesh D'Souza's of the world can kind of occasionally make a very small point about is that places like the Soviet Union tended to be incredibly science-driven type of bureaucracies, even if it was perverted. So how would you respond to that?
Right. Well, of course, when you phrase it that way, and we envision the lab coat guy out there with his calibers, saying this race is inferior to that race or whatever. So first of all, the whole eugenics thing was mistaken anyway. It's wrong. It's pseudoscience. But even if it turned out it was right, and let's say blacks really are inferior to whites or whatever your preferences there, but still the idea of rights for all sentient beings would trump that idea. That even though you think this is the problem with utilitarianism, it's too easy to make the trolley calculation. I'll flip the switch for the trolley to save the 5 workers and kill only 1 worker. Almost everybody agrees. Yeah, that seems right. And but then it's easy to go from, well, I'll kill these 1 million people to save these 5 million people, or kill these 10 million people to save the 50 million people, and all of a sudden you have you have a genocide. Yeah. And so that's the problem with utilitarianism, and it's the problem with allowing just deeper, more important principles like rights to be trumped by just some scientific theory, even if it turned out it was right. But even there, see, I'm making a case for natural rights, that we can. These are things we discover about our human nature, that we have this desire to flourish and survive, and therefore. Again, you have to start somewhere, so I start there, and from there I can say, well, we discovered natural rights. We discovered that this is through study and research that this is what people really like. This is what helps them survive and flourish. And there's a huge body of literature now on happiness. Tons of books about it. What people need. They need meaningful work, family, friends, social connections, and some kind of spiritual or a deeper, fulfilling purpose to your life, that kind of thing. Okay. Well, we know that now. Mm-hmm. So there's all sorts of things we shouldn't do because it, reduces that.
Let me ask a question related to something you said, but I fear maybe slightly off topic. But I think it's on a topic that I hope is of interest to our audience. It's we're sitting here with the editor of Skeptic Magazine, who is famous for debunking pseudoscience, for distinguishing actual science from pseudoscience. And
You're very, very good at that, yes.
And this – I mean, we're inundated every day with all sorts of claims that claim to be scientific, statements that, we've got to do this, we've got to do that, and there's science behind it. Mm-hmm. So just for those of us living in the world and exposed to this stuff, what is the difference between science and pseudoscience, and how do we tell?
Right. Well, this turns out to be a hard problem because it's what Karl Popper called the boundary problem. That you can clearly see something that's super extreme, that's just crazy, that's not true, psychic power or something like that. But there's a lot of gray areas in there that it's not quite clear. Cold fusion. What was that? String theory is. It's not quite science. It's not really pseudoscience. It's in that gray area. And so it ends up being something of a social construction of, good science is what most scientists accept and practice. It leads to a working hypothesis and paradigm that you can run experiments in and test, and it's useful. And it's been verified and corroborated from others and so on. And pseudoscience claims tend to be, isolated. They don't give you any testable hypotheses. They're just assertions and speculations and conjectures. And so that's kind of the difference. So it varies depending on which particular claim you're talking about. So like in alternative medicine, we deal a lot with this. There is no alternative medicine. There's just medicine that's been tested and scientific, and then there's everything else that's just claims.
Yes, medicine that's been proved to work – alternative medicine that's been proved to work is called
medicine. That's right. Right. Exactly right. So, even skeptics disagree on certain things about what science or pseudoscience. And also calling something pseudoscience has become something of a badge of really scolding somebody for believing something crazy. It's a pejorative term, like calling something a conspiracy theory. Well, there are conspiracies. So some of the theories are going to turn out to be right.
Yeah, MK Ultra really set back a lot, gave conspiracy theorists a lot of energy, kind of like how the coelacanth has let cryptozoologists be able to say about anything, well, it could be a coelacanth or a mountain gorilla. There was one period where they did not believe that, and now they just run away with it forever.
Yep. Right.
But your claim about scientists and scientific thought, I have to ask this question, not because I really believe it, but it brings up the global warming question, which I'm not qualified to have huge opinions about global warming, but you hear the question of, well, how is science done by consensus? There has to be someone out there who could be right and goes against the consensus.
Well, that's right, and that does happen occasionally, but not as often as you think. Most people on the margins or the heretics, they're usually wrong about their ideas. You just don't hear about it because – well, they were wrong, and they don't get published, or nobody pays any attention to them because they're not useful ideas. They don't lead to anything. So the idea, they laughed at Galileo and they laughed at the Marx Brothers. Well, they laughed at the Wright brothers. They laughed at the Marx Brothers. Being laughed at, doesn't really make any difference. Ultimately, you have to be right at some level, by which I mean corroborated by other people. So the reason climate scientists talk about this, 97% of climate scientists agree global warming is real. The reason that's done, that's not normally done. You never hear something like, 97% of scientists agree that
Saturn has 13 moons or something like that.
Yeah, you don't have to do that because it's not controversial. It only comes up because people on the 3% are making a lot of noise, and only because there's some political, economic ramifications that people feel it threatens their worldview. Nobody cares about the germ theory of disease or the plate tectonics theory of geology. That doesn't stir up political animosity amongst people. So it's only to that extent that we even talk about that. But the consensus process is an interesting one. This was the sociology of science and the history of science. They talk about, well, what does lead to a paradigm shift, and occasionally the young guys get a toehold with a new theory, and then they oust the old guys in the old theory. But that only happens if they are also right. And like Einstein replace Newton. No. Actually, Newtonian mechanics is just fine. It just doesn't work out on the extremes, and so you need a refinement of that, which is Einstein relativity. And we need further refinements with quantum mechanics. And okay, so there's more to come, but it's not like one's replacing the other. They're just sort of layered on top of layers.
This is that's what the scientism being governing our lives, and then we mentioned China. And the rights of people in China. And the big question is, when do you override these rights? I mean, that's what you mentioned. That's a really difficult question. And that becomes a difficulty in terms of when do we – for global warming to override the rights of poor Chinese people to get cheap energy.
Right.
Is there
Yes, I agree. That's a knotty political problem.
Can science answer that question?
Yeah,
though, when we should do that?
Well, not at the moment. We can't. I mean, you can make projections and employ the precautionary principle, which I don't like because it stifles innovation too much. I'd rather see us go, let the Chinese do whatever they want, but let's get them better technologies. In fact, let's do the Elon Musk approach. Let's just have all electric cars and let's just solve all these problems with better technology, as opposed to going backwards. Harder to go backwards, better to go forward, especially if there's a profit incentive. Or even just a value incentive. I mean, Elon Musk gave away the patents for all his electric cars. You know, he has a bigger goal. He has to make a profit because it's a company. But his bigger goal is let's make the world a better place. And, you know, okay, so that's a great example of what John Mackey calls conscious capitalism. You know, capitalism is good. It's okay to make a profit. Nothing wrong with making money. But we could also have other cool values too and add on to that.
You talk about governments providing the rule of law and a structured system of criminal code punishment, and that being a really important thing for us to flourish. But in the book, you also discuss the possibility that governments themselves might become obsolete at some point, and that moral progress might result in, say, the triumph of cities over larger governments. Can you talk a bit about that?
Mm-hmm. Yep. So before I wrote this book, I was always a small government libertarian. You know, just smaller the better. People just want to be left alone. Turns out not everybody just wants to be left alone. I've got a lot of letters about that, by the way. I don't want to just be left alone. I want somebody to take care of me. Oh, okay. All right. Go join a religion then or something, you know. But what I discovered through Pinker's book and other historical works, that in fact government was a good thing in terms of removing the whole self-help justice thing, which causes a lot of violence and homicide rates to be pretty high. Again, I'm just looking at very specific measurable things. Homicide rates are super high. How can we get them lower? Well, one thing is to have better policing, better enforcement of the rules and laws, better courts, better judicial system, and so on.
Yeah, it's probably better if you don't just go shoot someone because they stole something from you, and
right.
that's up to you to do that. Yes.
Right. Now, but of course governments can be abusive, and they have been, but not all of them. So again, it's like you're saying religion's the problem. It's too broad. You know, religion is a whole bunch of different things. You can't say government's the problem. Well, which governments? You know, some are way worse than others. And so the whole point of the political process is to try to refine it better and better. And I think we have been getting better over the long run at doing that. You know, I mean, police departments now have all these really like intelligent data-based policing. You know, really interesting programs in L.A. where, like, if a crime happens at this intersection here, you know, that increases by 50% that another one will happen within a block of there. So you send the cops there before the next one happens, and then that stops it. You know, they just know from data analysis, big data. And so more of that kind of thing. Again, very specific things like that. And then, so my long-term prediction, I'm just speculating in the last chapter of Protopia. You know, I don't know what's going to happen any more than anybody else, but that kind of problem solving can happen better at the local level. So, and then, you know, people like the Long Now Foundation, Stuart Brand, and, you know, these guys are talking about cities. Cities is where the action is. And now more than 50% of the world lives in cities. And you know, when mayors rule the world is this book I cited, and it's because that's where I call it the fixing the pothole problems. Again, I just want to be left alone, except for just, you know, let's fix certain problems that need to be fixed. And
there's no Democrat or Republican way to fix a pothole.
That's right.
To rip off of the LaGuardia's old quote.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. That's right. So in the long run, I think it would be better if governance happened more locally. Now that we have improved technologies of governance. We know how to do it better. That's a science. It's what's the best way to govern a group of people? We've tried everything for thousands of years, and we've got it down now. So, the idea of the problem with the nation state is that it's too large and nefarious and nebulous, and it could be nefarious, and you get these antiquated notions of the glory of war. It's just such an inane idea. Glory for who?
Yeah.
I mean, there is no it's just me and you. It's a bunch of people, and the glory of what does that do for me? And so again, the individual is the target, and I think the mayor is going to care more about me than the president. And maybe the mayor's assistant will care even more about me. So I think that could happen. I'm not sure. If you look at the consolidation of states from thousands and thousands down to a couple hundred over the last 500 years, the one worlders have sort of predicted.
You mean there were far more states? Further in the
political
past.
Units.
Political units. Yeah.
Small political units.
So 600 A.D. there were a ton of small little governments.
That's right. Yeah. Now, and in Europe there was something like 5,000 different political entities in 1500. So isn't that what I'm talking about? No, because they didn't know what they were doing. First of all, they just had walled cities, and they were just constantly at war with each other.
Like just Tuscany in Italy, for example, just constantly at war with each other.
Yeah, that's right. So we don't do that anymore. We've gotten past that now that we have the technology of how to build a society and infrastructure and governance. So going forward, maybe we'll bounce off at the bottom instead of having a one world government, where now I have to depend on somebody that lives 10,000 miles away to care about me, and they don't. Just back up to thousands of small political units, city-states.
I'm wondering how we make people governing sorts of people, so the people who might even be in charge of these small city-states care about that sort of thing.
The people who run for president.
So this is an issue that we talk a lot about on the podcast. We can say it would be great if people's lives were better, and there are these obvious ways that we can do it. But one of the problems with government is that the people get in, and there are all sorts of other incentives,
yes, right?
And so we can – this gets back to those kind of two possible ways of looking at moral progress, right? We know what the moral thing to do is, and we just need the better information on how to do it, which is kind of what you're describing, like if governments, if they just know how to govern correctly, and we just need to implement it. But then there's also the changing of the values, because there are people out there, lots of people running states who know this sort of stuff, but they want to protect their friends. They want to give them subsidies, or I happen to think what's helping my particular class, I convince myself, is in the interests of everyone. Like I've shrunk that moral circle.
Right. Well, the solution is a social technological one. You just have more checks and balances. 2 signatures on a check rather than 1, or maybe 3. It should be 3 signatures on a check before you can cash it, and something like that. So the founding fathers, the best things they did was to break up the power structure and have more checks and balances, and probably even more in terms of corruption. That's a big problem. There's no reason to think that you and I sitting here fully aware and conscious of how corrupt people can be and how bad that is, if we had the power reins, that we would not just go ahead and take care of our family and friends, just like the temptations are super strong given human nature. So that's why you need the outside source.
And we're recording this when I was interjecting with Aaron there, we're recording this the day after the State of the Union. So this is a particular day when libertarians feel that everyone just had a massive national delusion for about 59 minutes last night, and we had to watch it and grit our teeth to the whole thing. But at the same time, Aaron's point being that we watched this man stand up and talk about us as a family and how we have a common purpose, and this overuse of the term "we" and how he's driving the bus the entire time and people seem to believe this stuff, which is the question of whether or not the moral arc can bend away from thinking that that's the kind of situation we want to have, that we want someone to all address us and be the national father.
Well, some people do like that. Absolutely. That libertarians we are few in number for many reasons, but that's one of them. Some people like the idea of sort of a patriarchal led community that's going to take care of me, but that's also something you get used to or not. People grow up accustomed to public education, for example. So when I use the phrase government schools versus private schools, people like, what do you mean government schools? I don't send my kid to a government school. Well, actually, you do. They're public, right? Yeah, but that's not a – oh, okay. I mean, and these are the same people that are, super critical of government and say, well, I know government's always messed things up. Then why would you want to send your kid? This is the most important thing you will ever do as a parent is educate your kid. And you're just turning that over to people are incompetent. Okay, so, something like that. I forgot what the question was. But
what you're describing brings us back to why your vision of smaller city-states handling everything locally is so appealing, because it looks like you can say, yes, you might want this cradle-to-grave welfare state. You may think that's good. You may want these kind of national greatness plans and all that. And if you want that, there's a community there for you.
Run by Michael Bloomberg, yes.
Right, and if I want this other community that sticks to, a night watchman state and just protects rights, I can do that. And then we can look. We can see, are you actually working – is it working out for you, or is it working out –
exactly.
This is Robert Nozick's Utopia of Utopias idea.
Well, they're I like Sam Harris's metaphor of the moral landscape, title of his book, in which instead of looking for one single answer, multiple peaks on the moral landscape, some slightly better than others or whatever, but there's lots of solutions of ways to live. So libertarians are fond of these proprietary communities where, you like the community where no one's allowed to paint their door red, and you like it where everybody can paint the door any color they want, and so you live in the one and you live in the other. And that actually could work in principle. I think it does work. I mean, there's hotels or private proprietary communities that have roads, not only literal roads but vertical roads, elevators, and they have shops and places to get your hair cut. You can almost live in some of these Vegas hotels. You could actually never leave, which is the whole point. They don't want you to leave, and so those are like mini cities, and there's no reason why you couldn't extend that idea out. Now, of course, the rebuttal. Well, what about the terrorists with the nuclear bomb? Okay, well, obviously this is going to take a while. You have to eliminate those problems with better technologies.
Your position seems to be within the scientific, skeptical, atheist community that is your community. You thrive in your people. I imagine that as opposed to the sort of one government type of view, in my little sense of the community, it's more common to look at sort of the one government view, not like New World Order, but that progress is synonymous with more government than it is to have this sort of decentralization, more libertarian view.
Yeah.
How can we better convey this to that community, these ideas that decentralization might work better in terms of solving these problems and might create a better and brighter future?
Well, one way I've tried to do it is to that community all recognizes the power of bottom-up through evolution. Evolution operates through these, there is no central designer. There's no intelligent designer. We've debunked that idea. Natural selection is the designer from the bottom up. And in a way, the economy is like that, or the social systems are like that. They're self-organized. Even pirate societies, I've been writing about that in the book because of Pete Leeson's, it turns out these are organized societies. They have to be. It's too costly if everybody just does whatever they damn well please and kills each other. It's a net loss for the whole organization, right? So we got to have rules, and that does happen. So I try to show my fellow liberal atheists, that top-down solutions are not always the best ones, and the intelligent designer is debunked, and so the intelligent designer in government is maybe not always the right thing to do either. I don't know to what extent that works, because ever since I started calling myself a libertarian, I found out people just quit listening to you. They just go, "Oh, you're just a libertarian. Okay, I don't have to think about what you're saying." So sometimes I wish I hadn't said the word, just so that people would listen to the specific arguments you're making, because the labels, they really stick, and they're linguistic shortcuts to having to think.
Thank you for listening to Free Thoughts. If you have any questions or comments about today's show, you can find us on Twitter at FreeThoughtsPod. That's Free Thoughts, P-O-D. Free Thoughts is a project of libertarianism.org and the Cato Institute and is produced by Evan Banks. To learn more about libertarianism, visit us on the web at www.libertarianism.org.